Faced with a budget crisis deep into the billions, amid a deadly pandemic crippling a once robust economy and hobbling public education, Texas lawmakers will soon return to the Lone Star State Capitol. With scores of hard choices ahead and a host of deeply divisive issues to consider, will our state's elected leaders set aside partisan rivalry and collaborate for the common good of more than 30 million Texans? I'm Greg Groogan, and welcome to What's Your Point, where our panelists call it like they see it. Let's greet them. Starting us off, Rice University political analyst Mark Jones. Next up, well-known businessman and columnist Bill King. In the 3 spot, Charles Blain, founder of Urban Reform. Batting cleanup, Jasper Sherer, political reporter for the Houston Chronicle. And closing us out, former Houston City Council member and Vice Mayor Pro Tem Sue Lovell. Let's begin. When lawmakers gather in Austin on January 12th for the 87th session of the Texas Legislature, they'll be staring 2 colossal issues square in the face: an ongoing pandemic still killing off their constituents, and a once thriving economy chewed up by the very same contagion, robbing state coffers of at least $4.5 billion. That is a very big budget hole to fill, especially when demand has collapsed for the oil and natural gas, which comprise your inherent wealth, employs hundreds of thousands of your citizens, and generates impossible to replace revenue for literally every facet of government.
My guess, and it's strictly a personal estimate, is probably double that, roughly, 8-9 billion. We don't know for sure. It depends on the run rate of sales tax revenue, and especially looking at oil severance taxes, et cetera. So it's really, the question is this: are we going to have to raise taxes? Now, I think that as a fiscal conservative, my answer would be no, because we've got a lot of this federal money sloshing around that we're trying to figure out exactly how to take advantage of. In addition, you don't want to raise taxes when you've had a Texas double whammy, which is COVID and the energy shock that we've all gone through.
Panel, what's left for Texas lawmakers is what we call a very tough row to hoe. I'm going to start with Mark Jones. Mark, what is the challenge ahead?
Well, the challenge is the combination of less revenue, but the same expenses, if not more expenses. I think as Senator Bettencourt said, we're unlikely to see any appetite for tax increases. There's going to be hope to rely on federal money. And then at the margins, try to find maybe some way to raise some revenue. We'll probably get another push for legalizing casino gambling, as well as potentially legalizing marijuana. The former, if the lobby is organized, might have some success. The latter, I would say, is very doubtful.
Bill King, you heard Bettencourt say the budget hole may be bigger than what we are hearing, that $4.5 billion. You think that's right?
Well, my understanding is the $4.5 billion is the current budget we're in right now. They didn't meet their revenue estimates, and then you've got to worry about the next biennium, which is going to be maybe $8 or $9 billion. It looks like. I think that the 4.5 is relatively easy to fill. It's going to require, some sacrifices, but we've got, I think, $11 billion in the rainy day fund, which, by the way, is a good argument for not going out and spending it all the time. This circumstance. I think you're going to see probably Medicaid expansion, which would help ease some of the budget difficulties. But overall, I think it's going to be challenging, but not a dire situation.
Sue Lovell, it doesn't sound like there's much money there for all of the unmet needs in Texas.
Well, I mean, obviously, with everything that's happened, it would only make sense that we're going to have a lot of needs when we get there at the legislature. To me, it's a matter of how they're going to prioritize what we need to deal with first. We'll have a new speaker. If COVID stays the way that it is, I understand he may convene and then send everybody home for 30 days. So I think this is a very different legislative session that we've ever seen before. So I think it's very hard to predict what's going to go on based on past performances.
Jasper, you talk to politicians for a living, and a lot of these politicians that are heading to Austin in January, what is your sense of their perspective going in?
Yeah, I mean, I expect a pretty lean session, just in the sense that lawmakers are going to end up devoting a lot of their energy to filling these budget gaps. And, you have to remember that Texas is one of only a handful of states that have not had their legislature convene since the start of the pandemic. So that just obviously figuring out COVID relief is going to take up a lot of that time and energy. So at the same time, the ledge has been here before. They've, seen big budget gaps that they've had to fill in prior sessions. There's almost $9 billion rainy day fund that can be tapped into, as Bill mentioned. And then, I think, as my understanding is, some of the estimates that have been made so far don't take into account the 5% budget cuts that the state leaders have asked the agencies to make. So again, a lot of unpredictabilities, but I think it's important to remember that lawmakers have been here before and they've always figured out how to pass a balanced budget.
Charles Blain, Republicans are firmly in power. They fought off that attempt to flip the Texas House. How will that play, particularly in this physically challenging time that we're in?
I think the first thing is they need to take raising taxes off the table, especially when they just slapped the local governments down for proposing the same thing. But I think Jasper makes a really good point about the state agency cuts. Apparently, or according to the comptroller, that amounts to about $1 billion in savings there. And then you have COVID funding, which can offset some general expenses that have been expended on COVID-related items. And then that they could swap that out. But also, I think what they should do is they should cap the maximum threshold for initial expenses at about 5%, or initial appropriations at 5% over the last budget. We need a conservative budget. It's time for them to actually act like it. And I think, to Bill's point before, this is a reason why they should stop tapping the rainy day fund for just ridiculous things that they claim are needs that aren't needs. Because when we actually do have needs, then we don't necessarily have the funding that we need to kind of carry us through it. So everyone made great points.
Mark Jones, the Texas Legislature has been here before, so to speak. I think back during the economic downturn around 2008.
No, that's correct. So there is a history of doing this. It's going to be really more, as I think Sue mentioned, prioritizing, figuring out what areas you're going to cut, what areas you're going to try to maintain, and if you're going to try to raise revenue, how to do that in the least painful way possible. That could be through essentially expanding Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. It could be legalizing casino gambling, or some combination thereof.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Still to come, new leadership in the Texas House as Beaumont Republican Dade Phelan wrangles sufficient votes to join the Big Three. And later,
what we're talking about speaks to not just moms, but reasonable gun owners, ensuring that guns don't get into the hands of individuals who can harm others.
Seems you can't gather in Austin without some kind of battle over the right to keep and bear arms. In the arm-twisting, horse-trading, honey-talking, backroom dealing popularity contest that is a race to be Speaker of the Texas House, Beaumont Republican Dade Phelan has accumulated more than enough support to take the gavel of power. Panel, what does Phelan's ascension to the Big Three of Texas government mean for the turbulent session to come? I'm going to start with you, Mark Jones.
Well, on one hand, it means we're going to have a rookie as the speaker in a very difficult session. Rookie in the sense of being a speaker. This will be his fourth term as member of the House. On the positive side, he does represent the sweet spot of being sufficiently conservative for a majority of Republican conservatives, but not too conservative for the moderate wing of the Republican Party or even Democrats. So at least on paper, he has the ability to lead the legislature in a constructive way, say like Dennis Bonnen did back in 2019. But we will have to see in practice. This will be his first session. And unlike Bonnen, last session was his first as speaker, but he'd been in the House for a long time. For Phelan, it's going to be learning on the job and learning in, I think as was mentioned, in a very difficult session whereby with the pandemic, things are going to be very different.
Jasper, what are you hearing out there?
I think Phelan is seen as generally a pretty honest broker who handled a lot of really tough legislation as chair of the State Affairs Committee last session. As Mark alluded to, he's palatable to kind of the both establishment Democrats and lawmakers who are you would consider more conservative than him. That sort of, I think that explains why he won the gavel. But you know, he carried a pretty large Hurricane Harvey relief package through the House last session, and there were a lot of really tough negotiations over that bill. So he clearly has demonstrated, you know, he has the skills to ascend to that position. And I think the uncertainties is where it kind of stand logically. I think some of that uncertainty helps explain why he has won such wide bipartisan support. You've got folks like, you know, Briscoe Cain and establishment Democrats lining up behind him. So I think we'll just kind of have to see what direction he takes things, because he's had 3 terms to establish himself, but we still don't know exactly where he lies on the conservative spectrum.
Okay, Charles Blain, there's been some smack talk on the right side of the right wing of the party. Will Phelan overcome that?
I did not initially, and I think Jasper hit it on the head by saying no one really understands where he stands ideologically. We can, you know, glean from various votes and things like that where he is, and there are ratings from Power Texans, Texas Right to Life, other conservative organizations out there that have rated him. But the problem is, the reason the conservative base is upset about this is because the process was done in the dark, and there was no conservative agenda laid out as for what he would carry through as speaker. So they don't know where he stands. And this is why you have conservative leaders coming out against. This is why you have the Texas Republican Party very vocal about it. And that's going to cause a problem going forward. I mean, I know that, you know, last session, the reason we're having this discussion is because of the conservative wing of the party. They're the ones who made life very hard for Bonin, and then ultimately we're in the position where we're looking at a new speaker now. And so I think there's going to be this animosity going forward as long as there hasn't been a clear path laid out about what the conservatives are going to accomplish going into this legislative session.
Okay, we're going to leave it right there. Up next, as much of America reimagines law enforcement, will Texas lawmakers firmly back the blue or create new rules for policing the Lone Star State? Welcome back. There's a partisan battle brewing in this coming legislative session over the issue of police reform. Now, in a state where Governor Greg Abbott has threatened to defund cities who cut funding to police and urged every elected official in Texas to sign his Back the Blue pledge, achieving comprehensive reform of law enforcement as proposed by many Democrats could be problematic. However, State Representative Ron Reynolds says the two goals shouldn't be mutually exclusive.
The real message should be, how do we do more community policing? How do we train officers in de-escalation? How do we address some of the systemic issues that happen and disparities happen with the minority and African-American communities? And that is the real reason that we're pushing for these reforms, not to defund the police. We want police to be well-funded.
Okay, folks, do you think lawmakers can find some middle ground here? I'm going to start with you, Sue Lovell.
Well, I don't think so, no. I think there'll be an effort, but I think the police unions at this point are very strong and very organized. And actually, the issues that Representative Reynolds talked about, those are really city issues that cities should deal with. I don't think the state should be mandating how each city does training with their police or neighborhood policing. But no, I think the unions will be really strong. I think there'll be a good effort. Maybe some good conversation, but ultimately, I'm not hopeful that anything will be done.
How about you, Charles Blain?
I think there will be, not on the Back the Blue stuff, but I do think that there's going to be unification around the anti-defund the police stuff, because, you know, conservatives are just naturally against it, but a lot of black lawmakers rightfully understand that that is not what their communities need. So I think there can be some rallying around that. But also, let's not forget that when George Floyd was murdered, Governor Abbott visited with the family and promised them that he would deliver on a George Floyd Act to make sure that he did not die in vain, and that there would be changes here in Texas, that we don't see things things happen here like that happened there. And so I think there could be some rallying around within that too. And that was one of the questions of when Phelan started to kind of ascend to the speakership was, did he make an agreement with Democrats to kind of talk about this? And we started to see some conservatives come out and speak about supporting an effort like this. So I do think there could be rallying around those points, but not everything.
Jasper, do you think the governor has to deliver something to this constituency?
You know, I think there's no real mandate for Abbott to do that specifically, but I think if lawmakers agree on something and he is essentially forced to decide whether to veto or not, it's really going to depend on whether this is what that decision is if the bill that comes before him is something, you know, grandiose and you know, that wouldn't be palatable to his conservative base versus some of these more kind of minor reforms that still would, you could see them have a large impact, but are more, you know, related to local jurisdiction. So extending the amount of time that police departments can have to discipline officers, you know, redefining the use of deadly force, things, you know, you could probably see some sort of bipartisan agreement on things along those lines, banning no-knock warrants. That's another measure that has, you know, I've seen conservatives at least, you know, indicate that they would be okay with that. So I think you could see something happen, but I don't think any of this kind of overarching, you know, big police reform packages, those could be a longer shot.
Bill King, you know how things work in Austin. Do you think that reform measures have any chance this session? I mean, there's a lot of public cry for something to happen.
Yes, it's sort of interesting. There's sort of, and I talk to legislators, I'm hearing two different things. I'm hearing, you know, people like Symphonia Thompson has the George Floyd bill that she wants to push various police reforms. But then I also hear conservatives like Bentoncourt and Coalhurst, you know, saying that the bail reform has gone too far and we have all these people out on bond, you know, committing murders, and that we need something kind of control on that. It'll be interesting to see whether or not they can come up with sort of a grab bag bill that has a little bit of something for everybody in it or not. My guess is that probably not a lot gets done, but I think there may be that sort of narrow path where you could take some from column A and some of column B and get a bill passed. All
right. Mark Jones, you've heard a lot of solid speculation there. A final word goes to you. Take about a minute.
I'm not optimistic about any massive change. This was a very strong, good issue for Republicans this election cycle across the country, and I don't see them giving it up, especially without a lot of pressure, and there's really not that much pressure for the public, at least their public, for this. Now, that said, I could see some minor symbolic reforms that allow them to effectively say, we've addressed the issue, sort of maybe doing something with the Sandra Bland Act if, for instance, law enforcement were willing to say not or to allow that we don't have arrests for fine-only offenses, which was part of the Sandra Bland Act in 2017 when it was stripped out. Maybe that, but I'm not too optimistic about any really serious police reform taking place.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. Absolutely no chance of defunding police. Still ahead, the logistical challenge of lawmaking amid a deadly pandemic. Up for discussion, COVID-19 and the nuts and bolts of executing representative democracy. Anyone who has worked on or around a Texas legislative session clearly understands that under normal circumstances, it is a process replete with near constant personal interaction. Obviously, when lawmakers reconvene, there will be nothing normal about the pandemic environment certain to prevail beneath the Capitol dome. Plexiglass dividers, expulsion of press, spectators, and lobbyists from their respective chambers, mobile sanitizing machines, virtual committee hearings, all potential measures clearly on the table, along, no doubt, with many others. Panel gathering in groups within a closed space seems somewhat antithetical from government leaders preaching public health. Can they get the job done safely? I'm going to start with you, Mark Jones.
Well, yes, they can get the job done safely, but it's going to be very different from what we're used to. Normally, both the Capitol as well as Austin are a hive of activity from early in the morning until after midnight. That's not going to be the case this session. So one effect I think will be lobbyists will be spending a lot less money on alcohol and food.
All right, Charles Blain, you have concerns.
Yeah, expulsion of the public should be off the table, full stop. It is absolutely ridiculous. They should do no activity if they are not going to let the public in the chambers to testify. We know that lawmakers don't like oversight, and so this is just prime for the pickings for them.
All right, Jasper Sherer, are you worried about getting kicked out as a member of the press?
You know, I'm not optimistic about it. You know, I think we'll see some sort of restrictions like temperature checks at the entrance once we do open, whenever that may be. Probably some committee hearings over Zoom, things like that. And there's a decent chance that the two chambers could have different restrictions, talking about the House and the Senate. So, you know, I think there's just still a lot up in the air that we don't know yet. Sue
Lovell, what's your take on this?
Well, we're talking about the Texas Legislature, which really doesn't like the sun shining on it. I think they'll be as happy as they can be if they can keep people out as much as they can. And the fight from the public will be to see what they're doing, have knowledge of what they're doing, and be involved in the process.
Bill King, what are you hearing from your sources in Austin?
I hear that that the House especially is likely to convene, elect Phelan, adopt rules, and then immediately adjourn for 30, maybe 60 days, and kind of leave the leadership there to sort of figure out the budget issues in that first couple of months, then maybe try to come back in March and get back to more of a regular order when the COVID numbers ought to be better by that time. But I think all of that's going to mean that this is just going to be a session where not a lot's going to get done because you've got budget, you've got redistricting, and then it's all going to be done under this, you know, impediment of COVID. So it's probably going to be a session where just not a lot gets done.
Mark Jones, you agree with that assessment? Not much going to happen?
No, it's really going to be difficult, and I think it's going to be a very elite-driven session between the legislature and then the lobbyists. But the overall public's going to probably have the least amount of impact on this session of any recent session.
All right. Oh, we're going to leave it right there. Coming up, the ultimate turf fight is on the table this session as lawmakers set about the often self-serving business of drawing new political boundaries. If you don't care, you really should. Our panel is going to set you straight. Welcome back. If all the challenges facing the 87th Texas Legislature weren't enough, lawmakers will also tackle the process of drawing new political boundaries for the coming decade. Now, if manipulated unfairly by the party with the upper hand, these lines on a map can expand and perpetuate power and leave entire communities with little voice or influence as politicians pick their voters and not the other way around. Texas Democrats had dearly hoped to have a better seat at the redistricting table, but that evaporated November 3rd when they failed to flip the Texas House. Here's an interesting take from Republican State Rep Steve Toth.
This is the kabuki theater of politics, where we're led to believe that the party in power makes all the decisions. I'm sorry, but if a Republican wants 75% majority in his area, so too does the Democrat, right? And so you're going to see Democrats and Republicans coming together to make sure that they protect themselves. This is not going to be something that's imposed on the Democrats. Don't make that mistake.
Panel, given our state's increasing population and changing demographics, what can we expect when it comes time to draw the lines this go around? Mark Jones, I'm starting with you.
Well, Republicans are in the driver's seat, and while Representative Toth has a point, that is, there are two things going on. One is incumbents want to have the safest district possible, but then the party at a higher level wants to win as many seats as possible and make their incumbents as safe as possible. Both forces are in play, but the latter one is, I think, going to be especially important in the Texas House and the U.S. House races, where Republicans, I think, believe that they can both increase their size of the delegation and protect some of their more vulnerable seats. The Senate may be more agreeable, where you'll actually have horse trading among Democrats and Republicans and end up with a map that's not all that different from what we have today, with the possible exception of Republicans might try to gain a little bit of advantage and gain one of the seats up in the Metroplex back.
Jasper, how do you see this thing going?
I think what Mark brings up is kind of this balancing act that Republicans are going to have to play, where they want to essentially decide how aggressive they want to be and, at the same time try to avoid spreading themselves too thin. And we saw that almost come to pass this past decade with especially the 2018 midterm elections. Things reverted a bit back towards the Republicans during 2020. But, I think they're going to have to take into account just the sheer rapidness of the growth of some of these districts in the urban and suburban areas, and think about what those districts are going to look like in 2030 and how comfortable they are making an aggressive play to expand their majority while also trying to shore up those districts that they retained only by single digits this past cycle.
Sue Lovell, I want to kind of reel this back into a civics lesson. Why is redistricting so darn important?
Well, it's who your representatives are. Look, I live in a neighborhood that's all chopped up between 2 state reps. I'm a congressional too, which means I'm paired up with a lot of the suburbs and then Montrose. It really does hurt the way you're represented not to be together and to be divided out. Look, the Republicans are in charge. They're going to do whatever they can to strengthen that position ongoing. And that's what this will be about. And the Democrats, I believe, will be playing defense to hold on to whatever they have. But when you're in control and you have the power, then you have the say.
Yeah, but Charles Blain, if you go too far, this thing can end up in court. It has happened in the past, correct?
Of course, and of course they want to avoid that. I mean, but as everybody has been saying, they're in the driver's seat. They're going to take full advantage of trying to shore up some of the districts that they feel that were a little too close last time. They're going to likely try to carve out some others, or they can ensure that Democrats will have those, but that will be kind of just cordoned off for them, and they're going to, try to expand their lead, expand our lead as well. So, I mean, it's the same thing if it was reversed and the Democrats were in the lead. It just happens to be Republicans, and so it's a nasty game that goes back and forth, but it's to be expected.
Final 30 seconds to Bill King.
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be a lot of changes in the state House and the state Senate. I could see the Republicans maybe trying to carve out something down there in Will Hurd's for the district in South Texas to make that Republican. I think it's going to be hard to figure out the numbers. I think the kind of adjustments, like I suspect that the Republicans are going to give up on the Sarah Davis now and Johnson district, make that a Democratic district, and move some of those Republican votes over into the old Bohack, Spring Branch out in that area to make those more solidly Republican. But what's going to be interesting with congressional seats, because we're going to get 3, maybe 4. It's a lot easier to do redistricting when you're getting seats as opposed to giving them up.
Got to leave it there. Next up, freedom, or the lack of it, will be up for debate at the state capitol, including a proposal to lift restrictions on how many Texas students can style their hair. The Crown Act is our topic after the break. Welcome back. Among the thousands of bills filed this session addressing issues large and small is the Crown Act, short for Create a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair. The legislation designed to ban discrimination against hairstyles associated with ethnicity was at least partially inspired by the controversy surrounding former Barbers Hill High School student DeAndre Arnold, who was suspended because he refused to trim his dreadlocks. Panel, if the past is any measure, even relatively ancillary bills like the Crown Act can trigger strong emotions and significant pushback. Charles Blain, I'm going to start with you. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, you guys don't know this, but for a long time, I had very long hair that when you pulled it down, it was down about here, and I had braids and all this other stuff. And so this would have applied to me at the time. But I think the thing is that this would be uncontroversial if it were just focused on school districts. I think when you start to do it in the private sector, that's when you're going to start to see a lot of pushback here in Texas from this. I don't think in that specific situation he should be suspended. I don't think any school should suspend you based on your hair. It's a natural thing. It is a representation of who you are. But I do think that when you start to come into what you can do in the private sector, you're going to start to get some pushback for that.
Sue Lovell, what do you think is going to happen with this issue in the state legislature this year?
Well, I can't even believe we have this bill and this discussion. We have far greater issues to discuss and worry about than somebody's hair. And, I'm all for you can wear your hair the way that you want to wear your hair. I'm more concerned about if you're going to get a good education, you're going to be able to go back to school, you have enough funding. And I think that's what everybody should be more concerned about, is the funding of the schools, how effective they are, than somebody's hair.
Jasper Sherer, you know as well as I do, issues like this can draw a lot of ink, meaning lots of stories, lots of coverage. What do you think?
Oh, I think, folks who are supportive of this legislation, they say it's necessary because you just keep seeing more and more stories of discrimination against, students in various Texas schools. And I think, Sue is right in the sense that there are going to be other matters that are, most people would probably consider a little more pressing than this. But lawmakers have found time to carve out to, address sort of one-off bills that maybe aren't directly related to the kind of central focus of the legislature. So I think it's in play. It's just kind of a matter of whether you get conservative buy-in at this point.
Bill Kim, I'm guessing it's going to be the big educational groups like the School Board Association, Superintendent's Association, who will decide whether something like this passes.
I guess, I don't know. My view is I don't think any level of government ought to be telling anybody how to wear their hair. I agree with Charles that I think I don't think you have a constitutional right to wear your hair however you want to. But for government to be dictating any of this stuff is ridiculous. And I'm in favor of them banning the school district from telling kids how they have to wear their hair.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Still ahead, with Houston and other Texas cities enduring a record number of gun-related homicides, the long shot campaign for new gun restrictions returns to the Capitol. Could this be the year some have a chance to pass? After a tumultuous year during which a record-shattering number of firearms were sold here and across the country, pushing any new gun restrictions through a Republican-controlled legislature will be a very, very tall order. Then again, Texas is the ground where gunmen in Santa Fe, Midland, El Paso, and Sutherland Springs collectively massacred 67 people. The trauma inflicted and the fear of future acts of gun violence have inspired reform advocates to make their case despite the odds.
Background checks. That addresses the issue of those who the criminal justice system have said, this is not somebody that should have access to a weapon. Extreme risk protection orders recognizes the fact that there's an individual who's in the middle of a mental health crisis of which they're a danger to themselves or others. They should not have access to a weapon.
Panel, that sounds reasonable. Any chance it or any other gun bill will become Texas law in this particular environment? Mark Jones, I'm going to start with you.
No, I really think there's very little chance of any significant reforms. In part, remember, all of those massacres occurred before the 2019 session, and I believe all of them did, maybe not all but one, and we didn't see any reforms come out of that session. I think this session, given the combination of the pandemic, the budget crisis, a new speaker who's going to want to avoid alienating potential legislators, all of that means we're not going to see any movement to expand Second Amendment rights, but we probably aren't going to see any movement to restrict Second Amendment rights either.
Sue Lovell, Ann Johnson, who just got elected, says folks in her district are really concerned about this issue, but it's not shared, apparently, if you listen to Mark, throughout the state.
I think Ann's probably correct. I think it's an issue in some places and not. But look, I don't think anything's going to pass. But I had the conversation, and I applaud the people that go to Austin, especially those that have lost their children to gun violence, to anybody that has. I think the conversation is good. I think you keep pushing for things that are reasonable, because who knows, someday something happens and it clicks, and people go, okay, that's a reasonable ask. I don't think the conversation is bad. I think it's healthy and good, but I don't think it will go anywhere.
Charles Blain, do you think there's any middle ground here, one of these common sense measures like the secure the gun type legislation or the things that Representative Johnson was talking about?
I mean, I think it's, common sense depends on who you ask. I think that changes. And I don't think, as someone in her district, and I think Sue is as well, and Bill, I don't agree with her, and I will be staying on top of her to see what she does. I think that we've seen an increase in gun ownership. We've seen an increasing black gun ownership. We see people are very fearful of what's going on. I think we want more rights rather than fewer. And so I don't see any sort of appetite there. And couple that with, as Mark said, a new speaker who's going to be kind of toeing the line, or not toeing the line, but kind of trying to get that middle ground. There's anger towards Abbott from the right, so I doubt he's going to move on some sort of, limiting of guns. So I don't see it happening this session, and I hope it doesn't happen this session.
Is that the way you see it, Bill King?
The problem with, what Ann said is reasonable when you say it quickly, but when you start breaking it down and say, well, we need to decide who is mentally healthy enough to have a gun. Well, how do you go about deciding that exactly? It's the devil in the details, and that's where this always breaks down. The other problem I have with it personally is we're not enforcing the gun laws we have. We just had a police officer that was shot and killed by an individual, had multiple firearms convictions before, and he was still released on a $100 bond. Why don't we think about maybe enforcing the laws we have, but we start dreaming up new ones that won't be enforced?
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Coming up, hundreds of millions of your state tax dollars spent patrolling the border. But with money so tight, can Texas still afford to do a job that truly belongs to the federal government? The state of Texas has been spending hundreds of millions of tax dollars each and every year on border security, a duty which is and always has been the complete responsibility of the federal government. Now, when the state was flush with surplus cash, no one complained much. But now with a monster budget hole and plenty of unmet needs, is this the kind of duplicative spending Texas can afford coming out of COVID? Panel, I'm going to send this over to Mark Jones. What do you think?
It would be certainly a good place to cut. It's money that is more symbolic than anything else. I remember driving from McAllen down to Brownsville, right along the border. And there was a stretch there where there was a DPS officer on the north side of the border staring south every quarter mile for about 10 miles. I mean, it's just, so it's a very inefficient use of resources. It's done primarily symbolically so that Republicans in Austin can say they're doing something about border security, but it certainly would be a good place to cut. Question is the political will there to actually do it, especially since we're moving from a Trump administration to a Biden administration where there's going to be strong critiques of what Biden is doing on the border, perhaps that he's not, quote unquote, doing enough.
Jasper Sherer, this border security spending is part of the boilerplate political speeches made by both Greg Abbott and Dan Patrick. Do you see it going away, or are they going to try to retain it?
Well, I think a lot of Governor Abbott's decisions during this upcoming session are going to revolve around, I think he's already wary of opening the door to a legitimate primary challenge after he's drawn some consternation from his base over his COVID orders. So I don't think he wants to. He's probably going to try to minimize, how much he's stoking things any further by, in this case, potentially removing spending that typically is there for border security. So, but on the other hand, like last session, there was a push to put an extra $100 million into the supplemental budget right at the end of the session for what was being called surge operations, and that got stripped out at the end. So I think that demonstrates that there's at least some will to, if you're deciding between the spending and not spending, to go with the latter. But it's just, I think it depends on how big the budget hole is and whether they can find other things to cut instead of border security.
Sue Lovell, does this kind of spending make any sense to you? Take 20, 30 seconds.
No, it doesn't. And look, we elect them to lead, and right now we're in a deep crisis. So they should be prioritizing what it is that we need our money for. I don't think the border is a priority, but they should then be coordinating with the federal government on how they could assist them. But the federal government should come along and take care of the border. They shouldn't stand by their old promises and not take care of what's going on here in the future and our future needs. They should cut the spending, spend it on something else, coordinate with the federal government to take it over.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Up next, the 2020 election has cleared the deck for the next round of political warfare. We ask our panel, who in the Lone Star State is likely to take a shot at leading the public? Welcome back. The end of one political cycle marks the beginning of the next. And so, like clockwork, the positioning, strategizing, and yes, the scheming has already begun for 2022. So which high-profile Democrat will challenge Greg Abbott for governor? Who will step up to take on Harris County Judge Lena Hidalgo? Who will look to replace scandal-damaged Attorney General Ken Paxton? There are, of course, many others. Panel, any intel or predictions regarding the state and local races on the horizon? I'm starting with our number one analyst, Mark Jones.
Well, I think probably for Democrats, it's going to be difficult to convince somebody to run against Greg Abbott unless the Biden administration goes gangbusters. Otherwise, that's probably a losing proposition. For Ken Paxton, our embattled Attorney General, our Chief Law Enforcement Officer with many legal issues, George P. Bush could be a challenge to him, although that's going to be tough sledding within the Republican primary, and Republicans may want to think about someone else. Here, I think in the county judge race, Lena Hidalgo effectively was gifted the current position when she was the only one who filed when everybody thought that Ed Emmett was unbeatable. Now there are a lot of Democrats who have paid their dues, have held many positions, and I think are chopping at the bit to run against her. That's a race, though, that will probably be decided in the Democratic primary rather than November.
Jasper Sherer, what kind of intel are you getting?
Well, I think on the other side of the coin, it'll be interesting to see who challenges Governor Abbott, whether he draws a significant primary challenge himself. You know, Alan West, the chairman of the state party, Republican Party, has been, I think, kind of floated as one of the most likely early contenders for that. I think there's also a lot of speculation right now about what Chris Hollins, the now former Harris County clerk, will do after he kind of raised his profile a bit during the 2020 election. I've heard, Attorney General floated as a potential office he would pursue. I think a lot of that will come down to whether Paxton runs again.
Okay, Sue Lovell, 10 seconds.
Well, it depends. I mean, I think there'll be some people that may have offers to go to Washington, so there may be more openings than people think. I think the most important race will be the county judge race, because you have 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and whoever gets county judge kind of holds the balance of power. I don't know if it'll be one in the Democratic primary, but I think there'll be a lot of people that'll jump in that race.
Okay, really quickly, Bill, what do you see coming in the county judge race? Real quick.
I think there's a good chance Denise Parker will get in that race, and I think also you'll see a high-profile African-American candidate.
Got to leave it there. Thanks for joining us, everybody. The conversation continues on a national level. Next with Fox News Sunday and host Chris Wallace. From all of us here, have a safe and healthy week.